group assembled, but I can see that we've had a really great day. Actually, it's the better part of 2 days, where we've traveled a lot of territory of the world of inequality, and I think that most recently we've realized that you can struggle all you want, but you can't get out of it. We're all buried in the inequality that we're talking about. And so we have to be a little bit modest about where we all are. We're all living in some degree of privilege, so let's do the best we can to wrap this up in a good way. Ananya Roy is Professor of Urban Planning and Social Welfare at the University of California, Los Angeles. And as she said earlier, the inaugural director of the Institute for Inequality and Democracy at UCLA Luskin School of Public Affairs. Ananya's scholarship is focused on urban transformations in the Global South, new regimes of global financialization, and most recently the urban land question. She's got two monographs that I know, which are both really, really good books. City Requiem, Calcutta, Gender, the Politics of Poverty, and Poverty, Capital, Microfinance, and the Making of Development, which is maybe a little bit what you're going to be talking about. I don't know, microfinance? No. Okay, the microfinance book is really good. I recommend it to everyone. I have a great quote from Michael Goldman on it, but I won't read it now. But in any case, she's a really, really, really interesting person and a good scholar, and she is now going to talk about inequality and democracy in the Asian century, the promise and limits of inclusive growth. She's going to talk for 30 minutes, then we're going to have some discussion, and then we're going to go have reception and then wrap this up. An open mic, there's going to be an open mic, more entertainment. So we're going to do this wonderful combination. I'm going to call it the Kanchan combination. It's party and serious heavy-duty talk. So this is the Kanchan combo. Party and serious talk, okay? So we're going to have the party now, serious talk, okay.
Well, good evening, everyone. I am absolutely thrilled to be here, and thank you for your patience. I know it's been a long day. Thank you, David, for the introduction, and a special thanks to Kanchan, Paula, and Anamika for making sure that I'm here. So I'm a little conflicted about what I'm going to present, because since the election of hashtag not my president, I find myself immersed in non-stop organizing and thinking about the ways in which that organizing must build on long-standing struggles, but also how this moment feels like a rupture. This conference and the day I spent here today, though, was a reminder of how much we have to learn from other parts of the world that have already looked right-wing nationalism in the eye and have stood up to right-wing nationalism and challenged it. But I'm conflicted because the work I'm going to present seems far removed from the immediate political struggles that confront us, and yet I hope it will not seem far removed to you. You will also see the connections with what Professor Menon presented earlier this morning, and that was not intended. So my talk today is focused on two conceptual framings, one that I call the Asian century, and the other that has come to be called inclusive growth. I'm interested, as you will see, in the intersection of the two and how at this intersection we might take up the dilemmas of inequality in the context of democracy. Or more specifically, the question of how spatialized inequality is produced and remade through the rule of democracy. So I'm going to start with a story. I knew this was a talk at the end of the day, so you will see a bit of snarky humor in this opening story. So this was at a glittering conference held at a 5-star enclave in Delhi, India, organized by the London School of Economics. It was titled The Urban Age, and it declared boldly that the future of humanity is being made in cities. I found myself on a panel across from Arvind Panagria, economist, holder of the Jagdish Bhagwati Chair at Columbia University, and as Professor Menon mentioned this morning, Vice Chair of the National Institution for Transforming India, the Modi government's policy think tank. Panagria argued that Indian cities had to be recast as growth machines and that to do so, they had to look towards a very specific model, the world-class city of Singapore. To become Singapore, he emphasized that urban India had to get rid of its slums, which he noted were clogging up its cities. It was a tired argument, one that we've heard so many times before, but it was more than an argument. It was an aspiration driving change in urban India. The aspiration to be Singapore, Dubai, Shanghai. Not so much those specific cities as a dream image. The urbanism of the Asian century, the dream image of the world-class city. In fact, if we are to ask Mr. Panagria, Dr. Panagria, what is the world-class city? His only reasonable response would be that every world-class city is like every other world-class city. It's a tautology, an absurd one, but one that defines the present era of global urbanism and indeed our inclusive growth. What mattered though for Panagria is that in world-class cities, the ones he dreamt of, such as Singapore, people who were in the way of urban development could be swept aside through authoritarian power to create global skylines of wealth and finance. And indeed in India, in the name of turning Mumbai into Shanghai, some of you might remember 2004-2005 in Mumbai, slum dwellers have been systematically and violently evicted. Or in the name of turning Delhi into a world-class city, hosting a world-class event. These images come from the work of my former student and our colleague Gautam Khan. So in anticipation of the Commonwealth Games, entire communities like this one, Pushta, about 150,000 people, have been erased in the blink of an eye. This, Panagria argued, was the path to development. And he dared to say at that conference what many thought but did not often voice. He said, some people will have to bear the pain. There will be human costs. Panagria's yearning for the world-class city obscures many issues, and I raise two obvious ones, but often the obvious needs to be stated repeatedly, and specifically in relation to Singapore. First, the wealth of cities and societies depends on the labor of those who are constantly being banished and expelled from these cities. Second, even with the exercise of police power, such inequality is difficult to sustain. Indeed, just weeks before that conference in Delhi, I'd spent a bit of time in Singapore. Singapore was abuzz by an unusual incident that had taken place a few months ago. On a Sunday evening in December 2013, in the Little India Historic District of Singapore, a foreign worker from Tamil Nadu, India, was crushed under the wheels of a municipal bus. His death triggered what came to be known as a riot, with the police unable to quell the outrage of South Asian workers gathered in the area. The incident was described in the Singapore media as, I quote, only the second riot in more than 40 years in tranquil Singapore. And it seemed to be a significant disruption in Singapore's carefully calibrated systems of inter-Asian labor management and containment. The foreign workers thus made visible are precisely those bodies that do not enter into the count of economic prosperity vaunted by Panagria. His Singapore model of growth cannot, in fact, bear such costs. But nor can the Singapore model of growth fully contain these necessary but unwanted bodies. Police power and urban quarantine are always exercised, but never sufficient. I read the aspirations and desires voiced by Panagria at that panel in Delhi as an example of the Asian century, of the striving for Asian models of growth. Such imaginations are undergirded by quite simplistic dualisms, such as a contrast between the slum-ridden Indian megacity and the slum-free cities of Singapore, Dubai, and Shanghai. But in the rest of my talk today, I will make note of a different imagination, one that is also a part of the Asian century, but that seeks to implement what has been called inclusive growth, and that seeks to govern rather than eradicate the slum. I do this as part of my new and ongoing research because so much of my academic career has been devoted to understanding the violent erasure of the poor from Indian cities. But I find that this seemingly new moment of inclusive growth requires of us a different politics of critique and action. One that in fact challenges the idea of inclusion and one that thinks about what happens when in fact people are included, and as Professor Menon says, when they're made visible to the state. As I do so, let me note that I deliberately use the term slum, because while it is a poor shorthand for the complexity and heterogeneity of urban habitation and tenure arrangements, it's a poor shorthand for dense and variegated economies of work and livelihood, I use the term slum because it delineates an object of administration and at times a horizon of collective action. I argue that governing the slum presents some interesting dilemmas which cannot be interpreted solely through the dominant conceptual frameworks of neoliberalization. So we can't dismiss the project of inclusive growth as, oh well, this is just good old neoliberalism dressed up. But nor can we perhaps address this politically through familiar frameworks of the right to the city. So I'm interested in examining the formation called inclusive growth, but also its political potentialities and our discursive limits in trying to understand this sort of project. So as Panagria was raging about the fate of the Indian megacity, so in fact, one of the most ambitious national urban planning endeavors in India was in its last phase. And its key target was precisely the object of his anxiety, the slum. Launched in 2005, the multi-billion-dollar National Urban Renewal Mission was not just named after Nehru, it was in fact evocative of Nehruvian modernization. One of the boldest parts of the National Urban Renewal Mission, which I've been studying ethnographically for a while, was the Rajiv Awas Yojana, or slum-free cities, as the program came to be nicknamed. Its mandate reads thus: to envision a slum-free India with inclusive and equitable cities in which every citizen has access to basic civic infrastructure, social amenities, and decent shelter. Sounds wonderful. In rhetoric, if not in practice, slum-free cities is an important departure from slum evictions and demolitions in India. The forced evictions of the poor in the name of urban development that so many of us have called out and that Panagria was in fact justifying. Now with slum-free cities, I'm not suggesting that the era of forced evictions or land grabs by the state is over. But I'm arguing that these practices are now being accommodated and justified within a new paradigm, which in India and in many other parts of the global south is concerned with including the poor. Put another way, critiquing Panagria's crude argument about development and its necessary human sacrifices is not sufficient. We also have to pay attention to the other modalities, the seemingly kinder and gentler modalities through which the Asian century is being made and lived. So as an example of inclusive growth, slum-free cities combines somewhat uncomfortably three arguments about the urban poor and indeed about equality and democracy. First, it expresses an impulse for social protection, even social democracy. The main author of the policy called it a New Deal for India's urban poor. It confers political recognition for the very first time in India on slum dwellers as urban citizens and pieces together key elements of an urban welfare state in the making. But second and simultaneously, slum-free cities expresses a vision of slum redevelopment, the transformation of slum lands into urban assets. And third, it does all of this and perhaps holds these two contradictory elements together by expressing great optimism about the inherent entrepreneurialism of slums and slum dwellers. So no longer seen as places of abject poverty and despair, slums are now examples of what a quite popular architectural exhibition has called Jagar urbanism. Jagar is improvising as making do with limited resources. This is an epistemology of poverty that sees the slum as a system of self-organization, of duct-taped ingenuity. Now, there are important contradictions across these three elements, right? What sutures them together, and especially in the case of slum-free cities, but also, as Professor Menon said, more broadly in the project of inclusive growth, is Hernando de Soto. Peruvian economist and libertarian thinker, well known for his work on the informal economy. De Soto's idea that the urban poor are, in his language, heroic entrepreneurs whose debt capital of slumlands can be converted into liquid capital lies at the heart of slum-free cities. In announcing the Rajiv Awas Yojana, India's then Minister of Housing and Urban Poverty Alleviation, in a talk titled, once again a tautology, Inclusive Paradigms for Inclusive Growth, concluded the following. She said, Mr. De Soto's work suggests that the poor do have the tools to bring themselves out of poverty, but they simply lack the capability which can be given to them by according them property rights. So security of tenure, check. Slum redevelopment, check. Entrepreneurism, check. I'm going to return to these questions of property and personhood that slum-free cities raises, but let me first situate the program very quickly in a global context that again you're all familiar with, but that perhaps it's worth reminding ourselves of, especially in the context of what has been hailed as the Asian century. In the 21st century, geographies of development are being rapidly rearranged. From economic ascendance in India and China to new transactions of aid and development across the global south, to the rise of the BRICS as a hegemonic formation, to a reshuffling of the Bretton Woods